Marcus Chen wiped the grease from his hands with a cloth that had seen better decades, watching the storm rage outside his workshop windows. The wind howled across the industrial moon of Karis, 7 like a wounded beast, carrying with it the metallic smell of ozone and the distant rumble of freight ships struggling to maintain orbit. His repair shop, squeezed between a defunct plasma refinery and a noodle stand that somehow survived on serving the worst food in 3 sectors, shuddered with each gust. The storm had been building for hours, and Marcus knew it would be a bad one. The weather control systems on this moon had failed 6 months ago, and the colonial government couldn't afford repairs. Just another reminder that humans sat at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy, scraping by on the scraps left by the greater species. He glanced at the half-repaired cargo hauler taking up most of his workshop floor. The ship belonged to Captain Torres, a gruff man who ran supplies to the outer mining colonies. Torres had promised to pay him in the morning, but Marcus had heard that promise before. Still, work was work, and on Karis, 7, you didn't turn down paying customers, even the unreliable ones. The communication console crackled to life, fighting through the electromagnetic interference of the storm. "All residents are advised to remain indoors," came the tinny voice of the emergency broadcast system. Wind speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. Structural damage reported in sectors 7 through 12. Marcus switched off the console and returned to his work. The hauler's engine manifold had 3 cracked seals and a burned-out fusion regulator. Standard wear and tear for ships that spent their lives jumping between systems, but fixing it properly would cost more than Torres could pay. Marcus would patch it well enough to fly, and hope it held together long enough for the next mechanic to deal with. Outside, something crashed against his workshop wall. Marcus looked up from the engine compartment, listening. The storm was getting worse. He should close up for the night, head to his small apartment above the shop, and hope the building supports held until morning. As he reached for the plasma torch to finish welding a seal, the front door of his shop burst open. Wind and rain swept in, along with 2 figures who stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and clearly exhausted. Marcus grabbed his wrench instinctively, ready to defend his shop from whatever trouble had just walked through his door. But instead of thieves or desperate refugees looking to rob him, he found himself staring at 2 young women who couldn't have been more than 18 years old. They were tall and elegant despite being drenched, with skin that seemed to shimmer slightly in the workshop's harsh fluorescent lights. Their hair was long and dark, and their eyes held an intensity that made Marcus take a step back. "Please," gasped the taller of the 2, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place. "We need shelter, just for tonight." The shorter one, who looked remarkably similar to her companion, swayed on her feet. Her lips were tinged blue with cold, and Marcus could see she was barely conscious. Without thinking, he dropped his wrench and moved to help her. "Easy there," he said, catching her arm as she nearly collapsed. "You both look half frozen. What are you doing out in this storm?" The conscious one looked around his workshop with wide eyes, taking in the cramped space filled with spare parts, tools, and the half-repaired ships that were his livelihood. "Our transport was damaged," she said carefully. "We managed to reach your establishment before it failed completely." Marcus guided the unconscious girl to an old office chair, noting how light she felt despite her height. Something was odd about these 2, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Their clothes, though soaked, looked expensive. Too expensive for anyone who would normally find themselves in this part of Karis. 7. "I'm Marcus," he said, grabbing a clean shop towel and handing it to the conscious girl. "Marcus Chen. This is my repair shop. You said your transport was damaged? What kind of ship?" The girl hesitated, wrapping the towel around her shoulders. "A small courier vessel. Nothing fancy. I'm Lyra. This is my sister, Nixa." Marcus noticed the pause before she gave her name, and the way she glanced at her sister before speaking. These 2 were running from something, and they didn't want to give their real names. In his line of work, he'd learned not to ask too many questions about his customers' business, but these girls looked like trouble of a kind he'd never dealt with. Still, they were clearly in need of help, and Marcus had never been able to turn away someone who needed it. His grandmother had raised him to believe that kindness was one of the few things that made humans special in a galaxy that often seemed to have forgotten they existed. "Well, Lyra and Nixa," he said, noting how both names sounded carefully chosen, "you picked a hell of a night to have ship trouble. Let me see what I can do about getting you both warmed up." He moved to his small emergency kit, pulling out a thermal blanket and a portable heater. The workshop wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, which was more than they'd find outside in the storm. Nixa stirred in the chair, blinking slowly as consciousness returned. When her eyes opened, Marcus felt his breath catch. They were the most unusual color he'd ever seen, a deep violet that seemed to glow with their own light. For a moment he could have sworn he saw something else in those eyes, something vast and ancient that had no business looking out from such a young face.
"Where are we?" Nixa asked weakly, her voice carrying the same strange accent as her sister's. "Safe," Lyra said quickly, moving to kneel beside her sister's chair.
This kind human has offered us shelter from the storm. Marcus watched the interaction between the two sisters, noting the way Lyra seemed protective, almost formal in how she spoke about him. These definitely weren't ordinary travelers. "I've got some hot soup in my apartment upstairs," Marcus offered, pointing to the narrow staircase that led to his living quarters. "Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up. You can wait out the storm there if you want." Nixa tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Marcus caught her before she could fall, and as he did, he felt an odd sensation, like a mild electric shock that ran from his hands up his arms. For just a moment, the air around them seemed to shimmer with heat waves, despite the cool temperature of the workshop. "Sorry," Nixa whispered, though Marcus wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't worry about it," he said, helping her toward the stairs. "Everyone needs help sometimes." As they made their way up to his apartment, Marcus noticed that both girls seemed to be looking around with intense curiosity, as if they'd never seen anything like his simple living space before. The apartment was small but clean, with a tiny kitchen, a living area that doubled as his office, and a single bedroom barely large enough for his bed and dresser. "It's not much," Marcus said, suddenly self-conscious about the modest space. "But it's home." Lyra was staring at his collection of old paperback books with fascination. "You read physical books?" "Yeah," Marcus said, surprised by the question. "I know it's old-fashioned, but I like the feel of real paper. Plus, they don't need power or network access." Nixa had moved to the small window that looked out over the industrial sector of Keris. 7. Through the rain-streaked glass, the lights of the spaceport flickered in the distance, and the occasional flash of a ship's engines could be seen through the storm clouds. "This is where humans live," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. "Sadness? Surprise? In places like this?" "Some of us," Marcus said, moving to his tiny kitchen to heat up the soup. "The lucky ones, anyway. There are plenty who don't even have this much." He found himself studying his unexpected guests as he worked. Now that they were in better light and starting to warm up, he could see that their features were delicate, almost ethereal. Their skin had a subtle luminescence that he'd initially attributed to the storm's weird lighting, but seemed to persist even under the steady glow of his apartment's cheap LED fixtures. And there was something about the way they moved, a fluid grace that suggested they were far more than they appeared to be. When Lyra reached for one of his books, her movements were too controlled, too precise, as if she was consciously restraining herself. "So," Marcus said, ladling soup into 3 mismatched bowls, "what brings you to this corner of nowhere?" "Keris. 7 isn't exactly a tourist destination." The sisters exchanged a look, and Marcus saw entire conversation pass between them in a glance. Lyra spoke first. "We're traveling," she said carefully. "Seeing the galaxy. Learning about different worlds and their people." "Must be nice," Marcus said, bringing the bowls to his small table. "I've never been off this moon. Can't afford passage, and my ships aren't rated for interstellar travel." Nixa looked up from her soup with surprise. "You've never left this place?" "Nope. Born here, raised here, probably die here. That's life for most humans these days." Marcus shrugged, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "We're not exactly welcome in most places." "But why?" Nixa asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "Humans are... they're known throughout the galaxy." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, we're known all right. Known as good laborers, decent mechanics, and disposable soldiers. We're the species that other races hire when they need someone to do the jobs that are too dangerous or too boring for them to handle themselves." Lyra was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You speak of your own species with such resignation." "It's not resignation," Marcus said, settling into his own chair. "It's reality. Humans had our chance of greatness, back when we first reached the stars. But we were too busy fighting each other to notice that every other species was passing us by. By the time we figured out how to work together, the dragons had already claimed half the galaxy, the crystalline entities controlled the trade routes, and the mechanical collectives had locked down the best technology." He took a sip of his soup, watching his guests over the rim of his bowl. Now we're just another client species, and not even a particularly important one. We're useful enough to keep around, but not powerful enough to matter. Nixa set down her spoon with a sharp clink. That can't be how other species see humans. Trust me, Marcus said. It is. I've been fixing ships for 10 years, and I've worked on vessels from every major species in this sector. The way they talk about us when they think we're not listening, we're tools to them. Useful tools, but still just tools. The storm outside chose that moment to unleash a particularly violent gust of wind, shaking the building and reminding them all of the world beyond Marcus's small apartment. In the sudden quiet that followed, Lyra spoke. What if things could be different? She asked softly. What if humans could be more than just tools? Marcus looked at her, noting the intensity in her violet eyes. What do you mean?
I mean, Lyra said slowly, what if there was a way for humans to claim their place as equals in the galaxy?
What if the right opportunity came along? Then I'd say you've been reading too many fantasy novels, Marcus replied with a sad smile. The galaxy doesn't work that way. The strong rule, the weak serve, and humans are definitely among the weak. Nixa and Lyra exchanged another look, and Marcus saw something pass between them that looked almost like determination. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside his small apartment, Marcus found himself wondering exactly who these mysterious sisters really were and why they seemed so interested in humanity's place in the galaxy. As the night wore on and the conversation turned to smaller things, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had brought him something far more significant than two refugees seeking shelter. There was something about Lyra and Nixa that suggested they were much more than they appeared to be, and their questions about humanity seemed to come from a perspective that was both alien and deeply informed. But Marcus Chen was just a mechanic on a forgotten moon, and he had learned long ago not to look too deeply into mysteries that were probably beyond his understanding. For now, it was enough that he could offer warmth and safety to two young women who needed it. Sometimes that was all a human could do. What he didn't know, as he offered them his bed while he slept on the couch, was that his simple act of kindness had just set in motion events that would shake the foundations of the greatest empire in known space. Marcus woke to the smell of something burning. He rolled off his couch, instantly alert despite having gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep. The storm had finally passed some time before dawn, leaving behind an eerie quiet that felt almost more unsettling than the chaos of the night before. But that burning smell meant trouble, and in a repair shop full of combustible materials, trouble could turn deadly fast. He padded barefoot to the kitchen, expecting to find that his ancient heating unit had finally given up, but instead found Nixa standing at his stove with a look of intense concentration on her face. What appeared to be the remains of several eggs were scattered across the cooking surface, charred beyond recognition. I thought I would make breakfast, she said without looking up, her voice carrying a note of frustration that seemed disproportionate to the situation. As a way to thank you for your kindness.
Marcus rubbed the sleep from his eyes, taking in the scene.
Somehow, Nixa had managed to burn eggs so thoroughly that they looked like small chunks of coal. The pan was warped from heat, its non-stick coating bubbled and peeling. Even more strangely, the burner itself seemed to be glowing with a dull red heat that was way beyond what his cheap electric stove should have been capable of producing.
It's the thought that counts, Marcus said diplomatically, reaching over to turn off the burner.
But maybe next time start with something easier, like cereal?
Nixa stepped back from the stove, and Marcus could see tears of frustration in her unusual violet eyes.
I'm not used to cooking for myself. That made sense. These girls clearly came from money, probably had servants to handle things like cooking and cleaning. But as Marcus looked more closely at the ruined pan, he noticed something odd. The metal wasn't just warped from heat. It looked like it had been exposed to temperatures that should have been impossible to achieve with a household stove. No worries, he said, opening his cupboard to pull out a box of instant breakfast bars. These aren't gourmet, but they'll keep you going. Lyra emerged from the bedroom, looking more refreshed than anyone had a right to after sleeping in a stranger's bed during a storm. Her hair was perfectly arranged despite having no access to proper styling tools, and her clothes, which had been soaked and wrinkled the night before, now appeared immaculate. Good morning, Marcus, she said with a formal politeness that reminded him of diplomatic recordings he'd seen on the news feeds. I trust you slept well? Well enough, Marcus said, though he'd actually spent most of the night wondering about his mysterious guests. In the harsh light of morning, they seemed even more out of place in his modest apartment. Everything about them, from their perfect posture to the way they spoke, suggested they came from a world far removed from the industrial moon of Keros. 7. As they shared breakfast around his small table, Marcus found himself studying them more carefully. Nixa seemed younger somehow in the morning light, less controlled than her sister. She fidgeted with her food, shot glances around his apartment, and seemed to be making an effort to sit normally instead of with the unnaturally perfect posture she'd displayed the night before. Lyra, on the other hand, appeared to be studying him just as intently. She asked careful questions about his work, his life on Keros, 7, and the other humans who lived in this sector. Her interest seemed genuine, but there was something analytical about it, as if she was gathering intelligence rather than making small talk. "So you repair ships for all the different species?" Lyra asked, breaking off a piece of breakfast bar with delicate precision. "Pretty much," Marcus said. "Mostly human cargo haulers and mining ships, but I get the occasional alien vessel when they can't make it to the main spaceport. Different species, different technologies, but engines are engines at the end of the day. And they all treat you fairly?" Nixa asked, with the same odd intensity she'd shown the night before when discussing humanity's place in the galaxy. Marcus paused, suddenly aware that this was not casual conversation. Both sisters were hanging on his every word, as if his answer was far more important than it should have been. "Define fairly," he said slowly. "They pay me usually. They don't rob me or trash my shop. But I wouldn't say we're equals if that's what you're asking." "Can you give us an example?" Lyra pressed. Marcus set down his breakfast bar, studying their faces. "Why do you want to know? You asked similar questions last night, and I'm starting to wonder if you're journalists or something." The sisters exchanged one of their meaningful looks again, and Marcus saw Nixa give an almost imperceptible nod. "We are not journalists," Lyra said carefully. "But we are interested in learning about how different species interact, for reasons that are difficult to explain." Before Marcus could ask what she meant by that, his workshop's emergency comm system crackled to life, filling the apartment with static in an urgent voice. "This is Imperial Survey Vessel Drakmor to all stations in this system,"
came a deep, resonant voice that carried an unmistakable note of authority.
"We are conducting a priority search for 2 missing individuals. All civilian installations are required to submit to immediate inspection." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Imperial survey vessels were Dragon Empire ships, and they didn't conduct searches for just anyone. Whoever they were looking for was important enough to mobilize one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. He looked at his guests and saw that both had gone completely still. Lyra's face had drained of color, while Nixa looked like she was about to be sick. 2 missing individuals, Marcus repeated slowly. "Any chance you two know anything about that?" Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with what looked like a decision made. "Marcus, there's something we need to tell you, something we should have explained last night." "I'm listening," Marcus said, though he was already starting to suspect that whatever they were about to tell him was going to turn his life upside down. "Our names aren't really Lyra and Nixa," she began. "I am Princess Lyrelay of the 3rd House of Drakmor. This is my sister, Princess Nixara. We are daughters of Emperor Vorthak the Eternal Flame, sovereign ruler of the Dragon Empire." Marcus stared at them for a long moment, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he started to laugh. "Right," he said, "and I'm the secret heir to the Human Colonial Federation. Come on, what's the real story?" Instead of backing down or looking embarrassed, Nixara stood up from the table. As she did, her form seemed to shimmer, and suddenly the air around her was filled with heat waves. Her eyes began to glow with that violet light Marcus had noticed the night before, but now it was much more intense. "Show him, sister," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. Lyra sighed, then stood as well. As Marcus watched in stunned amazement, both sisters began to change. Their human facades didn't fall away so much as expand, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath. Scales appeared along their arms and necks, shimmering with iridescent colors that shifted from deep purple to gold. Their eyes became fully luminous, and when they spoke, Marcus could see fangs. But the most shocking change was their size. Both sisters grew taller, their forms becoming more imposing, more regal. The cramped apartment suddenly felt even smaller with these 2 transformed beings standing in it. "We are what humans call dragons," Lyrelay said, her voice now carrying the same resonant quality as her sister's. "Though we prefer the term Drakmori. We are the ruling species of the largest empire in known space, And our father has been searching for us for the past 3 days. Marcus sat down heavily in his chair, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing.
Dragons were legends, myths that had somehow become real and conquered half the galaxy. They were beings of immense power and intelligence, creatures that most humans would never see in person and certainly never share breakfast with. "Why?" he managed to croak. "Why are you here? Why did you run away from all that?" Nixara's form shimmered again, and she resumed her human appearance, though now Marcus could see the illusion for what it was. "Because our father intends to use us as bargaining chips in a war that will destroy billions of lives. The Dragon Empire has been expanding for centuries," Lyrelay explained, also returning to her human guise. "But we've reached the point where further expansion requires eliminating the smaller species entirely. Father plans to arrange marriages for both of us with the leaders of allied empires, creating a coalition powerful enough to sweep away every independent world in this part of the galaxy."
"Including the human colonies," Nixara added softly. Marcus felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. "You're telling me that you're both dragon princesses who ran away from home to avoid arranged marriages that would start a war of extermination?" "Essentially, yes," Lyrelay said. "And you ended up in my repair shop because the storm damaged our shuttle. And yours was the first building we could reach," Nixara said. "We had no idea who you were or what you did. We just needed shelter." Marcus stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the industrial landscape of Keris. 7. In the distance, he could see ships launching from the main spaceport, their contrails drawing lines across the pale morning sky. Somewhere up there, a Dragon Empire survey vessel was looking for the two beings currently standing in his kitchen.
"So what happens now?" he asked without turning around. "Do you go back and get married to prevent a war? Do you keep running? What exactly is the plan here?" "We don't know," Lyrelay admitted. "We hoped that by seeing more of the galaxy, by understanding the species that would be affected by Father's war, we might find another solution. Some way to convince him that conquest isn't the only path forward."
"And what have you learned so far?" Marcus asked, finally turning back to face them. "That we were incredibly naive," Nixara said with bitter humor. 3 days ago, we thought we understood the galaxy. We thought we knew what other species were like, how they lived, what they wanted. But everything we believed was based on reports from our father's advisors and our own limited experience with diplomatic functions. We had no idea that humans lived like this." Lyrelay gestured around the apartment. "No idea that any species lived like this. The poverty, the resignation, the sense that your place in the galaxy is fixed and immutable. It's not what we were told to expect." Marcus felt a laugh building in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was from humor or hysteria. "So you discovered that the galaxy isn't a fair place. What did you think it was going to be?" "We thought," Nixara said slowly, "that the lesser species were lesser because they chose to be, that they lacked ambition or intelligence, or the will to improve their circumstances. We were taught that the Dragon Empire's dominance was natural, inevitable, because we were simply superior. But you," Lyrelay said, looking directly at Marcus, "you showed us kindness when you had no reason to. You shared your food, your shelter, your warmth with complete strangers, even though you clearly have very little to spare. That's not the behavior of a lesser species. That's the behavior of someone with a nobility that has nothing to do with power or wealth." The communication system crackled again, this time with a different voice. "This is Colonial Authority traffic control to all vessels in the Keras. 7 system. Imperial Survey Vessel Drake Moore has been granted emergency search privileges. All civilian installations will be inspected beginning at 0900 local time. Compliance is mandatory." Marcus looked at his watch. It was 8:15. "They'll be here soon," he said. "If they find you here, what happens to me? Do I get vaporized for harboring fugitive princesses? Or do they just throw me in prison for the rest of my life?" Lyrelay and Nixara looked at each other with expressions of horror.
"We never thought," Nixara began.
"Of course you didn't," Marcus said, surprised to find that he wasn't angry. "You're used to having power, to being in control of situations. You probably never considered what might happen to the people who helped you along the way." He walked back to the table and sat down, rubbing his temples. A headache was building behind his eyes, the kind that came from trying to process too much information too quickly. "Here's what's going to happen," he said after a moment. "You're going to change back into your dragon forms, walk out of here and surrender to your father's people.
You'll go home, have your weddings, and help start your war.
And I'll go back to fixing ships and pretending this never happened.
No, Nixara said firmly. We won't do that to you. And we won't give up on finding another solution.
Then what do you suggest? Marcus asked. Because I can't see any way out of this that doesn't end with me dead and you two married off to whoever your father thinks will make the best alliance.
Lyrelei was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes unfocused as if she was thinking furiously.
Finally, she looked up with an expression that was half hope and half terror. What if we don't run? She said slowly. What if we go to Father and tell him what we've learned? What if we try to convince him that there's more strength to be gained through alliance than through conquest? You think he'll listen? Marcus asked.
I don't know, Lyrale admitted. But I know that running away won't solve anything. It will only delay the inevitable and put more innocent people like you at risk. Nixara nodded slowly. Sister is right.
We can't keep running, but we also can't go back unchanged.
We need to bring Father something that will make him reconsider his plans. Like what? Marcus asked. Both sisters looked at him with identical expressions of dawning hope. Like you, Lyrale said softly. Like proof that humans are more than just useful tools. Like evidence that there are alternatives to conquest. Marcus felt his headache getting worse. I'm just a mechanic. I fix ships. I'm not exactly ambassador material. But you are exactly what Father needs to see, Nixara insisted. You represent everything good about humanity. Everything that our empire would lose if we destroy your species. The communication system crackled once more, and this time the voice was much closer.
Imperial Survey Vessel Drakmor to Karas.
7 Industrial Sector 12, beginning inspection sequence. Prepare for boarding. Marcus looked out his window and saw a ship descending through the morning sky. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. A massive vessel that seemed to be made of living metal and fire. Dragon ships were as much works of art as they were machines of war, and this one was clearly built to impress as much as to intimidate. Too late for negotiations, Marcus said, watching the ship settle onto the landing pad near his workshop. Looks like we're about to meet your father. But Lyrale was smiling, and there was something in her expression that reminded Marcus that she was, despite her youth, a princess of the most powerful empire in known space.
Not father,
she said, but probably one of his generals. And that gives us an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Marcus asked, though he was already pretty sure he wasn't going to like the answer. An opportunity to show them exactly what humans are capable of, Nixara said, transforming back into her true dragon form, and to prove that some things are more valuable than conquest. Outside, Marcus could see armored figures disembarking from the Dragon Empire ship. They moved with military precision, and each one was easily twice the size of a human. In a few minutes, they would be knocking on his door, looking for the 2 dragon princesses who had spent the night in his care. Marcus Chen had thought his biggest problem was fixing Captain Torres's cargo hauler. Now he realized he was about to become either a diplomatic bridge between species or a very small footnote in the history of an interstellar war. Either way, his quiet life as a mechanic on Karas 7 was officially over. The knock on Marcus's door was more like controlled thunder. 3 precise strikes that shook his entire apartment and left no doubt about who was calling. Through his window, Marcus could see armored figures positioning themselves around his building, their movements coordinated with military precision. Let me handle this, Lyrale said, her dragon form now fully manifested and filling most of his small living space. Her scales had shifted to deep gold, and her eyes blazed with inner fire. You stay behind me and say nothing unless directly asked a question. Bad idea, Marcus said, surprising himself with how calm his voice sounded. If they see you like this, they'll know immediately that you've been hiding here. Let me answer the door as a normal human whose shop was used for shelter. You two transform back and pretend to be customers. Nixara shook her massive head, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the windows vibrate. They will smell our scent regardless. Dragon senses are far more acute than human perception allows for. Then we tell them a version of the truth, Marcus said, moving toward the door. You two were caught in the storm, you sought shelter here, and I helped you because that's what decent people do. Keep it simple. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Marcus could hear voices outside speaking in the deep, resonant tones of the Drakmori language. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were running out of patience. Both sisters shimmered back into their human forms just as Marcus opened the door.
The figure standing on his threshold was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen, even in his imagination. The dragon general stood nearly 3 meters tall, his form a perfect blend of humanoid intelligence and draconic power. His scales were a deep crimson that seemed to hold inner fire, and his eyes were like molten gold. He wore no armor, but Marcus got the impression that his natural hide was probably more effective protection than any manufactured defense. Behind him stood 2 smaller dragons in what appeared to be military dress uniforms, their scales a more subdued bronze color that still managed to catch and reflect the morning light. "I am General Kazeth of the 3rd Legion," the large dragon said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could move mountains. "I seek 2 individuals who may have passed through this area. You will submit to questioning." It wasn't a request. Marcus stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, and tried not to think about how his small apartment was about to be occupied by 3 dragons and 2 dragon princesses. The laws of physics suggested it shouldn't be possible, but somehow they all fit, though the space felt charged with barely contained energy. General Kazeth's golden eyes swept the apartment, taking in every detail. His gaze lingered on Lyrelay and Nixara, who had positioned themselves near the kitchen area and were doing their best to look like ordinary human travelers. "You are the proprietor of this establishment?" Kazeth asked Marcus. "Yes, sir. Marcus Chen. I run the repair shop downstairs. This is my home." Marcus was proud of how steady his voice remained, though inside he felt like his heart was about to explode. "And these individuals?" Kazeth's gaze fixed on the sisters. "Customers," Marcus said. "Their transport was damaged in the storm last night. They needed shelter while waiting for parts." One of the bronze-scaled dragons whispered something in their own language. Kazeth nodded and approached the sisters, his massive form moving with surprising grace. "You are travelers," he said to Lyrelay, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Lyrelay replied, maintaining her human disguise but unable to completely suppress the formal bearing that came naturally to her. "My sister and I are exploring this part of the galaxy." Kazeth circled them slowly, and Marcus could see his nostrils flaring slightly as he scented the air. The general's expression grew more thoughtful with each step. "Interesting," Kazeth murmured. "And you, mechanic?" He turned back to Marcus. "What did you think of your customers?" The question felt loaded with significance Marcus didn't understand. "They were polite," he said carefully. "Grateful for help. They didn't cause any trouble." "Did they pay you for this assistance?" Marcus hesitated. The truth was that payment had never even been discussed, but admitting that might raise questions about why he'd helped complete strangers. We hadn't discussed compensation yet. "I see." Kazeth was studying Marcus now with the same intensity he'd shown the sisters. "Tell me, human, what do you know of the Dragon Empire?" "I know you're the largest military power in this part of the galaxy," Marcus said honestly. "I know your ships are the most advanced, your territory spans hundreds of systems, and your word is law in most places. And what do you think of this arrangement?" Marcus felt like he was walking through a minefield. One wrong word could get him killed, but lying to a creature that could probably smell deception didn't seem like a viable option either. "I think powerful species do what they want, and weaker species adapt or get out of the way," he said finally. "That's how the galaxy works."
You sound resigned to this state of affairs. I sound realistic, Marcus corrected.
"I fix ships for a living. I see vessels from every species that travels through this sector. The patterns are pretty clear." Kazeth moved closer, his golden eyes boring into Marcus's. "And if you could change these patterns? If you had the power to alter the balance of species in this galaxy, what would you do?" It was a trap question, and Marcus knew it. But looking into those alien eyes, he found himself answering with more honesty than was probably wise. "I'd try to find a way for everyone to have enough," he said quietly. "Enough food, enough space, enough opportunity to build something decent for themselves and their families. I don't think the galaxy has to be a zero-sum game." Something shifted in Kazeth's expression. The intensity remained, but there was a new quality to it, something that might have been approval. "Naive," one of the bronze dragons muttered. "Perhaps," Kazeth said without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Or perhaps wise. Tell me, human, these customers of yours, did they express any opinions about the political situation in this galaxy?" Marcus felt Lyrelay tense behind him, though she made no sound. "We mostly talked about the storm," he said, "and they asked some questions about human colonies, but nothing that seemed political." "What sort of questions?"
About living conditions, about how humans interact with other species.
About whether we had opportunities for advancement. Marcus paused, then added, They seem surprised that most humans live in places like this. Kazith turned back to the sisters. Surprised, were you? At the living conditions of humans in this sector?
Yes, sir. Nixara spoke for the first time, and Marcus heard the strain in her voice as she fought to maintain her disguise.
We had been led to believe that all species in the Dragon Empire were well provided for.
Had you indeed?
Kazith's voice carried a note of dry amusement. And who, precisely, had led you to believe this? The question hung in the air like a challenge.
Marcus could feel the tension ratcheting up, could sense that they were approaching some kind of critical moment. Whatever game General Kazith was playing, it was about to reach its climax.
General, Lyrelai said, and her voice carried a subtle shift in tone that made Marcus look at her more closely. Perhaps we should speak more openly. Kazith's massive head tilted slightly.
I believe that would be wise, Your Highness. The formal address hit the room like a thunderbolt. Marcus felt his knees go weak as the implications crashed over him. The general had known who they were from the moment he walked through the door. This entire interrogation had been some kind of test. How long have you known? Nixara asked, dropping her human disguise. Her true form seemed to unfold from within her smaller appearance, scales shimmering into view like jewels catching fire. Since before I landed, Kazith replied. Your scent signatures were detected in this building's atmosphere from orbit. The question was not whether you were here, but what you had learned during your time away from the palace. Lyreli also revealed her true form. And suddenly Marcus's apartment was filled with 3 dragons in their full glory. The space should have been impossibly cramped, but somehow their presence seemed to expand rather than crowd the room. And the human? Lyreli asked.
Was questioning him part of your test as well? Indeed. Kazith turned back to Marcus, who was still trying to process the fact that his guests had just been revealed as dragon royalty to a general who had apparently been hunting them across the galaxy. I needed to understand what sort of individual had earned the trust of 2 imperial princesses.
He didn't earn anything, Marcus protested. I just gave them a place to sleep during a storm. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Kazith said firmly, they would not have. I have spent 3 days searching for their highnesses, and in that time I have encountered dozens of humans on various worlds. Most were terrified at the sight of my search teams. Others were obsequious, eager to provide information in exchange for favor or reward. None showed the simple, uncomplicated kindness you displayed. Marcus looked from the general to the princesses, feeling completely out of his depth. I still don't understand what any of this has to do with me. Father sent General Kazith to find us, Lyrelai explained. But he also gave him discretionary authority to evaluate any unusual circumstances surrounding our disappearance. The Emperor is not an unreasonable ruler, Kazith said. When his daughters vanished, he considered the possibility that they had encountered something important enough to justify their actions. He instructed me to investigate thoroughly before making any decisions about their return. And what have you concluded from your investigation? Nixara asked. Kazith was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes moving from the princesses to Marcus and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. I have concluded that their highnesses have learned something significant about the nature of the species under imperial protection, something that their fathers should hear directly from them. Marcus felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by suspicion. That sounds too easy. What's the catch? The catch, as you put it, is that such a conversation would need to take place at the imperial palace in the presence of the emperor himself, and their highnesses would need to bring evidence of what they have learned. What kind of evidence? Lyrelai asked. Kazith looked directly at Marcus. The kind that can speak for itself. The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. You want me to come with you, to the Dragon Empire capital, to meet your emperor? I want you to consider it, Kazith corrected. The choice is entirely yours, but I believe your presence could make the difference between war and peace for billions of lives. Marcus sat down heavily in his chair, his mind reeling. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know anything about politics or imperial policy. I fix ships. Precisely, Nixara said. You represent something Father has never encountered. A human who acts with honor and kindness. Not because it serves his interests, but because it is the right thing to do. You don't understand, Marcus said, looking around his modest apartment. I can't just leave all this. My business, my life, everything I've worked for is here. Your business consists of repairing ships for people who barely pay you enough to survive, Lirale pointed out gently. Your life is spent serving species that consider you inherently inferior. What exactly would you be giving up? It was a fair question, and Marcus didn't have a good answer for it. The truth was that his life on Keras 7 was barely a life at all. He survived, but he didn't thrive. He fixed other people's ships, but could never afford one of his own. He dreamed of seeing the galaxy, but had never left the moon where he was born. Even if I agreed, he said slowly, what makes you think your father would listen to anything I had to say? I'm just a human. That, Kazeth said with something that might have been a smile, is exactly why he would listen. The Emperor has been surrounded by advisors and nobles his entire reign, all of whom tell him what they think he wants to hear. But a human mechanic who has shown kindness to his daughters despite having no reason to expect reward, such an individual might speak truths that others would never dare voice. The communication system in Marcus's workshop crackled to life, interrupting their conversation. Captain Torres' voice came through the speakers, rough with frustration and worry. Chen? You in there? I need my hauler finished by noon. Got a contract that'll pay enough to keep me flying for another month. Marcus looked at the faces around him. 2 dragon princesses who had run away to prevent a war, and a general who was offering him a chance to influence the fate of the galaxy. Then he looked at his communication system, through which came the voice of a human cargo hauler who was struggling to survive just like millions of others across the galaxy. Give me a minute to think about this, Marcus said, standing up and walking to the communication console. He keyed the transmit button. Torres, it's Chen. I'm going to have to delay work on your hauler. Something important has come up. Important? Chen, if I don't make this run, I'll lose my ship. The bank's already breathing down my neck and... How much do you owe? Marcus interrupted. There was a pause. What kind of question is that? Just answer me. How much do you owe on your ship? 47,000 credits. Why? Marcus looked at General Kazeth. If I agree to come with you, could arrangements be made to help people like Captain Torres? Humans who are struggling just to keep their ships and their livelihoods? Kazeth tilted his massive head thoughtfully. The Dragon Empire has considerable resources. I believe such arrangements could be made, yes. Marcus keyed the transmitter again. Torres, consider your debt paid. Someone will be in touch with the details. Chen, what the hell are you talking about? Who's going to pay off my ship? Let's just say I'm about to take a new job, Marcus replied. One with better benefits. He turned back to face the dragons in his apartment, 3 beings whose casual conversation could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. All right, he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I'll come with you to meet your emperor, but I have conditions. Name them, Kazeth said immediately. First, I want guarantees for the safety of any humans who might be affected by whatever decisions come out of this meeting. Second, I want the Dragon Empire to establish programs to help human colonies and businesses that are struggling. And third, I want your word that I'll be free to return home when this is over, regardless of how the Emperor reacts to what I have to say. Agreed, Kazeth said without hesitation. Though I suspect that by the time our business is concluded, you may find that your definition of home has expanded considerably. As Marcus looked around his small apartment one last time, gathering a few essential belongings for a journey he never could have imagined, he realized that General Katheth was probably right. His quiet life as a mechanic on Keras 7 was over, but what was beginning in its place might be something far more significant than he had ever dared to dream. Outside, the Dragon Empire ship waited to carry them all toward an uncertain future, where a simple act of human kindness might just change the course of galactic history. The Dragon Empire's capital ship, Dominion's Heart, was nothing like any vessel Marcus had ever imagined, much less set foot aboard. Where human ships were cramped assemblages of function over form, built to maximize cargo space and minimize cost, this massive dreadnought was a masterpiece of engineering artistry that defied conventional physics. The corridors were vast halls that could have housed Marcus's entire workshop, their walls covered in flowing patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed from different angles. The lighting came not from harsh fluorescence, but from crystalline formations that pulsed with warm, living radiance. Everything about the ship spoke of a civilization that had never needed to choose between beauty and power, because they had achieved both in abundance. Marcus walked beside General Kazeth, trying not to gawk like a tourist while simultaneously failing completely in that effort. Behind them, Lyrelay and Nixara moved with the unconscious grace of beings returning to their natural environment, though Marcus had noticed they stayed close to him, as if his presence was somehow grounding them.
The Emperor is waiting in the heart chamber, Kazeth explained as they approached a set of doors that were easily 20 meters tall and appeared to be carved from single pieces of what looked like crystallized flame.
It is the most sacred space on the ship, where the most important decisions of state are made. Any advice on protocol? Marcus asked, suddenly aware that he was about to meet the most powerful being in known space, while wearing his work clothes and carrying a small duffel bag that contained everything he owned. Be yourself, Lyrele said softly. Father values honesty above all else. If you try to be something you're not, he'll know immediately, and he'll lose interest in anything you might have to say.
The doors opened without any visible mechanism, swinging inward to reveal a chamber that took Marcus's breath away. The room was circular and enormous, its domed ceiling transparent to the stars beyond.
At the center sat a figure that was clearly the source of the chamber's name, Emperor Vorthak the Eternal Flame. Vorthak was the largest dragon Marcus had ever seen, his scales shifting through every color of fire, from deep crimson to brilliant gold. His eyes held the accumulated wisdom and terrible power of centuries, and when he looked up from the holographic displays surrounding his throne, Marcus felt like he was staring into the heart of a star. "My daughters," Vorthak said, and his voice carried warmth that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation.
"I am pleased to see you safe."
Both princesses moved forward and executed elaborate bows that spoke of lifelong training in court etiquette, but Marcus noticed that their father's attention was already shifting to him, those ancient eyes studying every detail of his appearance and posture.
"And you are the human who sheltered them," Vorthak continued. "General Kazeth has told me interesting things about you. Marcus Chen of Karis."
7. Marcus had no idea what the proper protocol was for addressing a dragon emperor, so he settled for a simple nod. "Your Majesty."
"Your daughters were welcome in my home." "Were they indeed?" There was amusement in Vorthak's voice, but also something more dangerous. "And did you know who they were when you offered this welcome?"
"No, sir. They told me their names were Lyra and Nixa, and that their transport had been damaged in the storm. I helped them because they needed help."
"Simple as that?"
"Simple as that," Marcus confirmed. Vorthak rose from his throne, his massive form unfolding with liquid grace. As he moved closer, Marcus could feel the heat radiating from his scales, could see the way the air shimmered around him. This was a being who contained within himself the power to level mountains and burn skies, yet his approach felt more curious than threatening.
"Tell me, human," Vorthak said, circling Marcus slowly. "What did you think of my daughters during their stay with you?" Marcus glanced at Lyrelai and Nixara, both of whom were watching him with expressions of barely concealed anxiety. This felt like another test, but he was beginning to understand that honesty was his only viable strategy with these beings.
"I thought they were intelligent, polite, and surprisingly interested in how humans live," he said carefully. "They asked a lot of questions about living conditions, about how different species interact, about whether humans had opportunities for advancement."
"And how did you answer these questions?"
"Honestly, I told them that humans generally live in the conditions they saw on Karis. 7. That we work for other species because we don't have much choice. That most of us consider ourselves lucky just to have steady employment and a place to sleep." Vorthak's circling had brought him directly in front of Marcus again. The Emperor's eyes seemed to glow within a fire as he studied the human's face. "And what did my daughters think of these answers?" Marcus hesitated, suddenly aware that his next words might determine the fate of billions of lives.
"They seemed surprised, like they hadn't expected to find humans living in such modest circumstances."
"Modest." Vorthak repeated the word as if testing its flavor. "An interesting choice of terminology. General Kazeth described your living conditions as barely above subsistence level. Different words for the same thing," Marcus said with a shrug. "Most humans in the galaxy are surviving, not thriving. We've adapted to that reality. But you helped my daughters anyway, despite having little to spare." "Because I had something to spare," Marcus corrected. "I had shelter from the storm, hot food, and a warm place to sleep. When someone needs those things and you can provide them, you do. That's not special. That's just being decent."
Something shifted in Vorthak's expression, a subtle change that Marcus couldn't interpret. Behind the Emperor, the holographic displays showed star maps and fleet positions, the vast machinery of empire.
that this being commanded with absolute authority. Lyrily, Nixara, Vorthak said without taking his eyes off Marcus. Step forward. The princesses approached their father, and Marcus was struck by how young they suddenly seemed in his presence. Despite their dragon forms and their obvious intelligence, they were clearly children to this ancient being, and children who had disappointed him by running away. You left your home, Vorthak continued, abandoning your responsibilities and causing me considerable concern, because you objected to the marriages I had arranged for you. Is this correct? Yes, father, Lyrelai said, her voice barely above a whisper. And in the course of your flight, you encountered this human, and learned things that changed your perspective on my policies. Also correct? Yes, father, Nixara answered. Then explain to me, Vorthak said, his voice growing more formal, more imperial, what you believe you have learned that justifies your actions. The sisters exchanged a look, and Marcus saw entire conversations pass between them in that glance. Finally, Lyrelai stepped forward. Father, we have learnt that our understanding of the galaxy was incomplete. We believed that the species under Imperial protection were treated fairly, that they had opportunities for advancement, that their lives were comfortable and secure. And you have discovered otherwise?
We have discovered that humans, at least, live in conditions far below what we had been told to expect.
They work constantly just to maintain basic shelter and nutrition. They have no realistic hope of improving their circumstances, regardless of their intelligence or effort. And this concerns you because Nixara joined her sister, because it suggests that our empire is built on exploitation rather than partnership, because it means that the species we claim to protect are actually being oppressed. Vorthak's eyes flared with dangerous light. You would accuse me of oppression based on a few days spent with a single human? Not accusing, father, Lyrelai said quickly. Questioning, asking whether there might be better ways to organize our empire, ways that would benefit everyone rather than just the dragon houses. And what? Vorthak asked, his voice deceptively calm. Does our human guest think of this analysis? All eyes turned to Marcus, who suddenly found himself at the center of a conversation that would determine the future of countless worlds. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, could see the hopes and fears written on the faces of the dragon princesses who had risked everything for the chance to change their father's mind. I think, Marcus said slowly, that your daughters have good hearts and want to do right by everyone in the galaxy. But I also think the situation is more complicated than they realize. Vorthak's head tilted slightly. Explain. The problem isn't that you're evil or that your empire is fundamentally wrong, Marcus continued. The problem is that you're so powerful that you've never had to think about what life is like for the powerless. When you can reshape reality with a thought, it's hard to understand what it means to spend your entire life just trying to survive. You suggest that I am out of touch with the lives of my subjects? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could get him vaporized. I'm suggesting that when you're a Dragon Emperor, every problem looks like it can be solved with Dragon Emperor solutions. But most of the problems in this galaxy aren't Emperor-sized problems. They're human-sized problems that require human-sized solutions.
Such as making sure that species like humans have real opportunities for education, for starting businesses, for participating in galactic society as equals rather than just workers, such as making sure that the wealth and knowledge of the Empire actually trickles down to the people who need it most.
Vorthak was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. Around them, the heart chamber hummed with barely contained energy, the crystalline walls pulsing in rhythm with the Emperor's breathing. You speak of equality, Vorthak said finally. But equality between species of vastly different capabilities is a complex matter. Dragons have power that humans cannot match. Should we pretend otherwise? No, Marcus said. But having more power doesn't automatically make you more valuable as a person. It just makes you more responsible for how that power gets used. And how would you have me use this power? Marcus looked at Lyrelai and Nixara, both of whom were watching him with expressions of desperate hope. He thought about Captain Torres, struggling to keep his cargo hauler running. He thought about the millions of humans across the galaxy who worked hard every day for wages that barely kept them alive. He thought about all the species that had been pushed aside as the great empires expanded. I'd use it to build something better, he said. Not an empire based on conquest and domination, but one based on cooperation and mutual benefit.
Create trade partnerships instead of tribute systems. Establish educational exchanges that let every species learn from every other species. Build a galaxy where power flows both ways, where the strong protect the weak but also learn from them. A noble vision, Vorthak said, and there was something in his tone that Marcus couldn't interpret. But naive, perhaps. The galaxy is not a peaceful place. There are threats that require strength to counter, enemies that respect only power. Then be strong enough to protect what matters, Marcus replied. But don't let that strength become an excuse for crushing everything that's different or smaller than you are.
The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Vorthak studied Marcus with those ancient burning eyes, while Lirelei and Nixara held their breath, waiting to see whether their father would be swayed by the words of a human mechanic who had shown them kindness during a storm.
Finally, the Emperor spoke. General Kazith, what is your assessment of this human's character? Honest, competent, and possessed of wisdom beyond his station, Your Majesty. Kazith replied immediately. He represents the best qualities of his species. And you believe his observations have merit? I believe they deserve serious consideration, Your Majesty. Vorthak turned back to his daughters. You risked much to bring me this perspective. You abandoned your responsibilities, caused a galaxy-wide search, and delayed important negotiations with our allies. Was it worth it? Ask us again in 100 years, Lirelei said quietly, when we can see what kind of galaxy we've built together. To Marcus's amazement, Vorthak smiled, an expression that was both terrifying and strangely warm on his draconic features. Very well, the Emperor said. We will attempt this experiment in enlightened governance. The marriages you so disliked will be postponed indefinitely. Instead, you will serve as ambassadors to the lesser species, working to implement the reforms our friend Marcus has suggested. And the war you were planning? Nixara asked. Will become a war against ignorance and inequality instead of against our neighbors, Vorthak replied. Though I reserve the right to revisit that decision if our enemies interpret mercy as weakness. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. Somehow, impossibly, it had worked. A simple act of kindness during a storm had grown into something that might actually change the galaxy for the better. There is one condition, Vorthak added, and his gaze fixed on Marcus again. Our human friend will remain with us as an advisor, to ensure that our reforms are properly implemented, and to serve as a voice for those who might otherwise go unheard. Marcus's relief vanished, replaced by a different kind of anxiety. Your Majesty, I'm honored, but I'm not qualified to advise an emperor. I fix ships. And now you will fix an empire, Vorthak said with finality. Unless, of course, you prefer to return to your repair shop and let someone else determine the fate of your species. Looking around the hard chamber at the faces watching him, Marcus realized that his choice was both impossible and inevitable. He could go home to his small, safe life on Keris. 7. Or he could stay and try to help build a better galaxy for everyone. All right, he said, setting down his duffel bag with a gesture that felt like crossing a bridge he could never uncross. I guess I'm staying. But I'm going to need help. This is bigger than anything one person can handle alone. You will have all the help you require, Vorthak promised. And Marcus Chen of Keris. 7? Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you for sheltering my daughters during the storm. That simple act of kindness may prove to be the most important event in the history of our empire. As Marcus looked out through the transparent dome at the stars beyond, he couldn't help but wonder what his grandmother would have thought about her advice on kindness leading to this moment. Probably, he decided, she would have told him to stop overthinking it and get to work. After all, a galaxy wasn't going to fix itself. 3 years later, Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of the orbital platform that had become the nerve center of the Dragon Empire's reformation efforts. Through the transparent aluminum walls, he could see a dozen different species of ships coming and going from the docking bays, their crews representing every corner of the galaxy.
Human cargo haulers worked alongside crystalline entity trade vessels.
Mechanical collective survey ships shared navigation data with Dragon Empire destroyers. The platform buzzed with activity that would have been impossible just a few years earlier, when species separation and hierarchy had been the defining characteristics of galactic civilization. The Education Exchange Program reports have arrived from the Outer Rim colonies, Nixara said, approaching with a data tablet in her hands. She still preferred her human form most of the time, finding it easier to interact with the various species that frequented the platform.
The results are even better than we projected. Marcus accepted the tablet and scrolled through the information, smiling at what he read. Human children learning advanced mathematics from crystalline teachers. Dragon younglings studying human engineering techniques. Mechanical collective units discovering the value of organic creativity through art classes taught by a dozen different species. Your father is going to be pleased, Marcus said, handing the tablet back. These test scores suggest we're creating the first generation of truly galactic citizens. Speaking of father, Lorelei said, joining them at the observation window. He wants to see you in his office.
Something about the Centauri sector situation. Marcus sighed. The Centauri sector had been one of their biggest challenges, a region where several species had been so oppressed under the old system that they'd initially refused to believe the Dragon Empire's reformation efforts were genuine. It had taken months of patient negotiation and concrete demonstrations of change before they'd agreed to participate in the new programs.
Good news or bad news, he asked. With father, it's usually both, Lorelei replied with a grin. As Marcus made his way through the platform's corridors, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that stormy night on Keris. 7. His official title was Special Advisor to the Emperor on Interspecies Relations, which sounded impressive but basically meant he spent his days solving problems that no one had ever imagined would need solving. How do you create fair trade agreements between species with radically different concepts of value? How do you establish educational standards that work for beings with completely different neurological structures? How do you build trust between groups that have been enemies for centuries? The answers, Marcus had learned, usually involved a lot of listening, even more patience, and the occasional creative application of practical engineering principles to social problems. Emperor Vorthak's office aboard the platform was smaller and less intimidating than the heart chamber, but it still managed to convey the immense power of its occupant.
The walls were covered with holographic displays showing the status of reform efforts across the Empire, while the Emperor himself sat behind a desk that appeared to be carved from a single massive crystal.
Marcus, Vorthak said without looking up from the reports he was reviewing.
I need your assessment of the Andromedans. Marcus took a seat in the chair that had been specially constructed to accommodate his human proportions. Which Andromedans? The trade delegation that wants to establish new shipping routes, or the military faction that's been testing our borders? Both, Vorthak said, finally looking up. The trade delegation claims they're interested in joining our reformed empire, but intelligence suggests the military faction is planning some kind of provocation. I need to know if the trade interest is genuine or if it's a cover for something more aggressive. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering.
The Andromedans were a relatively new player in galactic politics, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century. They were proud, militaristic, and deeply suspicious of established powers like the Dragon Empire. My gut says the trade delegation is genuine, Marcus said finally. From what I've read of their culture, they value individual achievement and economic success above almost everything else. Our new profit-sharing models and merit-based advancement systems would be incredibly attractive to them. And the military faction? Probably testing to see if our reforms have made us weak.
They're used to dealing with empires that rule through fear and domination. They want to know if we're still capable of defending ourselves. Vorthak nodded slowly. Your recommendation? Invite the trade delegation here for formal negotiations. Make sure they see everything we've built, all the species working together, all the prosperity we've created through cooperation instead of conquest. At the same time, make sure our fleet is visible and ready in the sectors where the military faction is causing trouble. Show strength while extending friendship? Show that we're strong enough to be kind, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Vorthak smiled, an expression that had become more common over the past 3 years, but still sent a thrill of unease through Marcus's human nervous system. I will implement your suggestions. Now, there is another matter I wish to discuss with you. The Emperor stood and moved to one of the holographic displays, which showed a detailed map of the galaxy with thousands of colored indicators representing different species, trade routes, and political relationships. Our reforms have been more successful than even I anticipated, Vorthak said. Productivity is up across all sectors. Interspecies conflicts are at their lowest levels in recorded history. Educational achievement has increased dramatically among all client species. That's good news, Marcus said, though he detected something in the Emperor's tone that suggested there was more to the story. It is indeed so successful, in fact, that we have attracted the attention of powers beyond our traditional sphere of influence.
The Galactic Core Consortium has sent ambassadors expressing interest in our methods.
The Outer Rim Confederacy wants to establish formal trade relations. Even the mysterious entities from the Dark Nebula have made contact for the first time in millennia.
Marcus felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. That sounds like it could be either a great opportunity or a massive problem.
Precisely my concern.
We have proven that our reformed empire can work within the territory we currently control, but expanding these principles to truly galactic scale will present challenges we have not yet faced.
Vorthak manipulated the holographic display, zooming out to show the entire galaxy. Marcus could see the Dragon Empire's territory marked in gold, but it represented less than a quarter of the total galactic civilizations.
I want you to lead a diplomatic mission, Vorthak continued. A tour of the major galactic powers, demonstrating our reforms and exploring the possibility of expanding our alliance model beyond traditional imperial boundaries.